Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the series of lectures on vascular physiology. My name is Ali Eid, and I am in the Department of Pharmacology and Toxicology, if you remember me from your Med 1 year. These are a series of 3 lectures, as I mentioned, where we discuss pressures, arteries, veins, and the endothelia at the very end. The vascular system is developed, you probably also cover this later on in embryology. It develops as a tube heart at the beginning, and then it starts to assume its pumping function by the 4th week. The heart becomes a 4-chambered organ by the end of the 7th week, and after that there are very few changes that take place structurally, that is. What's important here is that as we get to discuss the physiology and later pathophysiology, it's important to have a good grasp of the basic phenomena that are going to help us understand why the vascular network is structured the way it is. And that becomes clearer in the next few slides. So for vascular development to take place, there are certain rules that we abide by. We do abide by the laws of physics. We do abide by the laws of chemistry and so on. There are important factors that need to be taken into the context when we're discussing vascular development. Some of these parameters are referred to as constraints. These are 3 or 4 constraints, the most important of which are physiological constraints and physical constraints. What we mean by physiological constraint is something very simple but very unique, very interesting. Contrary to what some people believe, and that would be a mistake, that the arteries actually branch from the heart away and they go to the different tissues. It's actually backwards. They start away from the heart and they join back the heart. We're talking about during development. And the elegant thing about this is the following. Had it been the opposite way, had it been that the heart is going to send all these arteries, that they will branch and they will arrive at the different tissues, then we would be giving all the tissues roughly equal amounts of vascularizations. And that may not be wise, because some tissues are not as metabolically active. Why would you give them the same? Why would you deliver the same amount of oxygen and glucose and other nutrients to a tissue that's not as metabolically active as a tissue that is very metabolically active? In other words, if I am a metabolically active tissue, I would definitely need to be more vascularized than a tissue that is not as metabolically active as me. So how do we do that? The metabolically active tissue is going to release some chemicals, some signaling cues that are going to help the basically stem cells and other cells that are important for the development of blood vessels. It will send them these messages so that more blood vessels are going to be made within its vicinity, and that's how it becomes highly vascularized, or relatively more vascularized than a tissue that is not as metabolically active. So this is very important to make sure that we are delivering the right amount of blood, the right amount of nutrients and so on to the tissues that are in most need for it. The second very important constraint, and we will elaborate on that in the coming slide, and you will also have more on this concept by Dr. Bez in the coming lectures. We abide by the laws of physics in biology. So fluid dynamics, and in this case the fluid is blood. This blood is moving in tubes, and these tubes are obviously arteries, veins, and so on. We are going to abide by the laws of fluid dynamics and mechanics to explain many concepts and to capitalize on the notions and phenomena that happen, and perhaps benefit from that clinically or in drug discovery and so on. And that will become clearer as we go through, and we'll talk about, for example, Korotkoff sounds and so on and so forth. So these are the 2 most important constraints. We'll elaborate in the next few slides on the physical constraint. I mentioned at the beginning that there are other constraints that are mentioned here and there. One of them is interesting, which is referred to as the genomic constraint. Now, there are no two people that have the same exact vascular network. None of us have exactly the same vascular network because part of it is genomically imprinted, genomically developed, and genomically affected. Yes, we do have a lot of similarities because these are critically needed. So the overall network is similar, but the minute intricacies of vascular system development and networking is different in different organisms, largely due to genetic differences. So that's one of the other constraints that we're limited by. And in some books, they do mention that there is some evolutionary constraint, but the basis for that is not very well understood. And usually they give the example of the looping of the aorta and so on. Let's start elaborating on the physical constraint. One of the important issues during vascular development is that as you're making this network, you need a large vessel to ensure that an ample supply of blood is delivered to the various tissues. And that's why we have large vessels such as the aorta. But the problem is, if the blood leaves the heart in the aorta, and let's assume that the aorta arrives as is, as an aorta, as a large vessel, into the vicinity of the tissues, to the distant tissues, exchange of material, nutrients, be it nutrients or gases or waste, from a very large artery where the blood is moving fast is going to be almost nothing. In other words, larger vessels help us ensure sufficient blood supply, but they are not good at all for exchange of material at the level of the tissues. How do we resolve this? One could say that all we need to do is we take that large blood vessel, and once we arrive at the level of the tissue, we make the diameter smaller. Well, apparently, if you go from a large vessel directly to a small vessel, remember you have the same amount of blood that you're going to pump in that given vessel. What's going to happen as the diameter decreases, the velocity is going to dramatically increase, and it would not be as easy to exchange also material with a fluid that's moving very quickly. So we're back to the same problem. If we need a large vessel for to ensure that we have sufficient supply to the distant tissues, but we also need smaller vessels that are where the blood is not moving at a very high speed, so that we have exchange of material. The way this is resolved is very simply by taking a parent vessel, the large vessel, and branching it into many smaller vessels, so that the total cross-sectional area of the daughter vessels is larger than the cross-sectional area of the parent vessel. So it is as if we're going from a large vessel to a larger vessel. And once you do that, the speed is going to be reduced. And when the speed is going to be reduced in these daughter vessels, that is going to allow for efficient exchange. So the parent vessel, which is large, is going to help me deliver a sufficient amount. Thus, the many smaller vessels that have a total cross-sectional area larger than the parent vessel are going to allow me to have a more efficient exchange. So the laws of physics that we're bound by here is that the velocity is inversely proportional to the area. And of course, it is directly proportional to the flow. You have more flow, you have more speed, and vice versa. So this is one of the things that we're going to be affected by as we're developing the vascular system, or after development as well, because this law is going to be applied all over. Now, if you look at the different cross-sectional areas of the various vessels, starting from the aorta all the way to the capillaries and then back to the vena cava, you will see that the total cross-sectional area of the capillaries is approximately 1,000 times that of the aorta. So this, if you go back to the previous equation, to the previous slide, and you see that the speed is inversely proportional to the cross-sectional area, you can see why the speed is going to dramatically decrease once the blood arrives at the level of the capillaries, which is extremely important to allow efficient exchange. So if you look at this curve, you will find that in blue, the velocity is dramatically decreasing as we get to the level of the capillaries. So here is the level of the capillaries. You will see that this is the lowest speed in the in the blue, and that is directly related to the cross-sectional area. The highest total cross-sectional area is that of the capillaries. Now, the blood that we have is distributed in different parts of your body, as you would know. We'll come to a point later on when we talk about venous reservoir, and we will say that 60 to 68% of our blood is basically stored in the venous part of the vascular tree. But the important element here to mention is that the numbers that you see on this figure are dynamic. They're not really all the time exactly like that. All right. So, but roughly speaking, this is at rest. This is basically 84%, 85% of our systemic circulation, of our blood is in the systemic circulation, and approximately 9 to 10% in the pulmonary circulation, and 6 to 8% in the heart. Now, this is a question for you to think about. How can you explain the notion that capillaries, which assume the largest area, as you saw in the previous slide, yet they have the lowest percentage of blood distribution? So go back to previous slides and try to figure it out. If you couldn't, email me and I'll be happy to send you back the answer. The answer is very simple. It's the question, the way it's phrased maybe is going to make it look like it is tricky, but it's not. And this is one of the questions that you can work on. The answer is given in the slide, at the bottom of the slide. So this is basically looking at the cardiac output of an adult, and that's approximately 5.5. In this, it's 5.5, so it could be 5.6. And you have the area of the systemic capillaries. We already know that, and they've given you the diameter of the aorta. So you would have to be able to calculate the velocity in the aorta and that in the capillaries and compare them. The answer is related to the idea of velocity is directly related to flow and inversely proportional to the area. You can solve that by, since you know the diameter, and thus you can calculate the cross-sectional area. It's important that we're looking at the cross-sectional area. Again, also, if you couldn't understand the solution that's given at the bottom of the slide, please feel free to email me or give me a call at my extension, 4891. There are three basic principles of the circulatory function that will help us understand many lectures to come. Number one, the blood flow to most tissues is controlled according to the tissue need. We mentioned this. We mentioned that during development, that's a part of the equation, that a metabolically active tissue is going to secrete molecules to allow for more vascularization or vascular development in its vicinity, and we explained why that would be important physiologically. Let's say after the vascular network has been developed, some tissues sometimes, due to certain, let's say, exercise or whatever, they would need a very large amount of blood supply than the amount delivered to them at rest. So sometimes 20 times more blood flow is needed when a given tissue or given organ is active. The problem is the heart is not able to increase its output 20 times. Maybe 5 to 7 times, that's the maximum we can get the heart to pump more than its baseline. And what we can do, however, to solve this issue, remember the general principle is that the blood flow to most tissues is controlled according to the tissue need itself. What we can do is that that very tissue, the one that needs more blood supply, is going to talk to the vessels in its vicinity, and we're going to basically dilate these vessels. At the same time, we're going to ask blood vessels that are far away from it, that are not delivering blood to it, to constrict. In other words, so we are going to ask far vessels to constrict, and thus the blood flow to those areas is going to be diminished. And the tissue is going to ask the blood vessels in its vicinity to dilate so that more blood is delivered to them. Because the far tissues, the far vessels have relatively smaller diameter now that we've constricted them, blood is going to be rerouted from those far organs or tissues to the tissue that is in more need of these nutrients and oxygens. Obviously, this is also assisted by neural controls and endocrine control. So neurohumoral control is also involved And this way, we do not have to overwork the heart, even if it could, because simply we are just playing with the regular distribution of the blood. The needy tissue is going to take what it needs. The other ones are not going to take more than usual. And this is a very fascinating phenomenon that happens especially when you discuss the sympathetic, the parasympathetic. They will teach you that blood is rerouting depending on the basic needs that are to be activated during that phase or that instance. Second basic principle is that the cardiac output is simply the sum of all the local tissue flows. And this is simple because this is a circulatory system. So if the blood is going through a tissue, it's going to pass through the tissue or come close to that tissue, leave, and is going to return backwards by the way of veins to the heart. So this is the idea behind this closed circuit that we have. The heart in this case acts as an automaton. What it does is it simply responds by pumping all this blood that has just come into it and puts them back into arteries, and the cycle continues. And the way it does this, you're going to have a lot of many lectures on the cardiac cycle and other needs. But for us, for the sake of these couple of lectures, it's basically going to respond depending on the demands of the tissues. Perhaps sometimes it will increase the cardiac output, sometimes it may not. But the idea is it's simply going to receive these blood that were collected from the various tissues and then pumps them back into the arteries, and thus they continue in the circulation. This doesn't mean the heart, despite the fact that it has some automaticity, it does not mean that it does not need help. Of course it does. Also, some neurons can help regulate, and hormones also sometimes play many roles, sometimes permissive direct role, sometimes permissive indirect role, and sometimes direct roles. The third important principle, and you will have 2 lectures on this with Dr. Badr, is that the arterial pressure regulation is independent of either local blood flow control or the cardiac output control, in the sense that the arterial pressure, the overall systemic arterial pressure, is regulated by many mechanisms that are independent of what's happening at that tissue that specifically asked, please give me more blood. So tissue 1 asked for more blood, tissue 2 said, okay, I don't need a lot of blood right now. What's happening at these 2 tissues? The local control mechanisms that guide this tissue to ask for more blood or that tissue to ask for less blood does not have a critical effect on the blood pressure regulation itself. And the reason for that is simple. You're going to have 2 lectures, I mentioned, short-term control and long-term control. Within seconds of, for example, pressure drop, a barrage of nervous reflexes and signals is going to take place, and the pressure is immediately restored. Few of the things that take place is we ask the heart to increase the force of contractility. We ask the heart to increase the rate. We go to the veins and we constrict them. Remember, a while ago I mentioned 60 to 68% of your blood is in the veins. So when we go to these veins and we constrict them, that venoconstriction is basically squeezing the blood out of these veins and bringing it back to the blood. Constriction itself is going to affect pressure because now we are basically reducing the surface area. And we are going to constrict arterioles as well. When you constrict these arterioles, that is going to immediately lead to an increase in blood pressure. There are a few other things that take place, but these are the most important ones. For the longer periods, we're talking about hours and days, not just few seconds, minutes. The kidney plays the most important function by releasing several hormones and as well as controlling blood volume. You will also cover that when you talk about the atrial natriuretic peptide, which is related to the atrium and how that is important for certain regulation of blood volume. So these are the 3 basic principles that govern the closed circulatory system and functions that we will be visiting and discussing throughout this course. To go back to the physical constraint, and I said this is probably one of the most important factors, the blood flow and pressure as well as resistance are governed by what we know from physics and electricity. If you studied undergraduate physics courses, the flow is directly proportional to the change in pressure. In this case, the change is P2 minus P1. So if P2 is smaller than P1, it means that we can go in this direction. So the flow is directly proportional to the delta P, change in pressure, the pressure gradient, and inversely proportional to the resistance or to the impediment that we have. Of course, the more resistance we have, it basically means that the less blood can pass through, or will pass through less efficiently, and that means the flow is going to be reduced. So this equation simply makes sense. You give more pressure across this vessel, more flow will go through. You have less resistance, and that means more flow will go through. Now, interestingly, blood flows basically in streamlines, imaginary lines, with each layer of these, each layer of the blood remaining roughly at the same distance from the vessel wall. So, as these are moving, they assume what looks like a parabolic profile, and the reason for that is very simple. The outermost layer is going to be the slowest because that's the one that is in closest proximity with the vessel wall, so it has the highest friction. So this and this outermost layer and this outermost layer are going to have the highest friction and thus the slowest speed. This is parabolic velocity profile. As you get to the center, the velocity is going to increase. For instance, this one is going to have the highest velocity. Why? Because it is moving between the two layers that are moving at the highest speed of all the other layers, except this layer. In other words, this layer, this imaginary layer, is moving between two layers that have the least friction among all the other ones, among all of these. So this comes to be the least friction and the highest resistance, and that leads to this parabolic profile. The layers, as we get away from the wall, the layers basically are slipping atop of each other or below each other. So if I'm slipping between two fast-moving streamlines, I'm going to move much easier than the one that is not. Turbulent flow, that is opposite to the laminar flow, these are usually met in conditions of high flow, such as in the ascending aorta, and in that case, the laminar flow may be disrupted. This also happens when there is an irregularity in a blood vessel. That could be at the valves, that could be at the site of a blood clot, that could be when you have an atheroma, and so on. So if we have these disruptions, irregularities in the blood vessel, that may give rise to disrupting the laminar flow, leading to turbulent flow, and that's why occurs in large arteries at branch points, because it's simply, if we draw here, this is an artery that was moving, and then we had to branch it like this, let's say. So blood was moving smoothly, and then it hit this. Once it hits this area, some turbulence is going to be created, and then we can continue later on in that direction or in this direction. Much like when you're watching a water stream and then you put a large stone, a large rock in the middle, you will see that water, as it comes to that stone, it will start to swirl and to move away, and that is the turbulence that has been created at the branch points. Obviously, when we talk about stenosis or obstructions or atheromas, it's basically if that's the blood, or actually it's here. So the layer that basically hit this has to change its direction. So all these imaginary streamlines are going to be disrupted, creating all this kind of mess, if you'd like. It creates turbulence, and that we'll talk about that as it has some clinical implications. So the turbulent flow has many implications. We need to remember that the kinetic energy is going to be lost when we are propelling blood axially and radially, and that happens in turbulent flow. It does not happen in laminar flow, because in laminar they're all moving roughly parallel to each other. In turbulent flow, we are going to the movement of the blood is going to be both axially axial and radial, and that is going to make us lose some kinetic energy. So instead of pushing the blood completely directly along the axis of the tube or the vessel, we're actually moving it a little bit to the sides, and we're going to lose some energy. So in other words, more energy is needed to drive turbulent flow than a laminar flow. So turbulence increases the energy needed. If you look at the curve, the graph that we have, so for a given perfusion pressure, as the pressure is increasing, the flow is going to increase. If the flow is laminar, you will see that as the pressure increases, the flow will continue to increase in a linear relation. However, there is a certain number or value beyond which a given vessel and a given flow within a vessel changes from laminar to flow. For every flow going through a given vessel, there is a number that we refer to as the Reynolds number. And that number basically is the point at which the flow changes from being laminar to being turbulent. What determines this number? The characteristics of the vessel and the flow. What are the factors that determine whether we are going to switch from laminar to turbulent? Actually, there are different parameters. They are the velocity, as you can see them here. The velocity, we're going to have the diameter, we're going to have density, and we're going to have viscosity. So you know the difference between viscosity and density. Viscosity is more related to the fluid's resistance to flow, how much the fluid resists to flow. That's viscosity, while the density basically is the amount of mass occupying a given space or a given volume. Now, as you can see in this equation, if the velocity increases, Reynolds number is going to increase, so we may go beyond the critical Reynolds number, and thus we may switch to turbulent. If you go back to the previous slide, you will see that one of the things we mentioned about turbulent flow is we mentioned conditions of high flow, such as in the ascending aorta. There is very high speed there, and laminar flow there may be disrupted. So this is one of the factors. We'll talk about the vessel lumen diameter. That's very important. If the diameter increases, the Reynolds number is going to likely increase, and that may lead to turbulence. And that's why in the previous slide also we mentioned large vessels. When we talk about the density, blood density, this is also important. If the density increases, obviously that means you have more mass per given space, and that's going to make the flow more turbulent. When we talk about viscosity, on the other hand, the more viscous the fluid is, the less likely the flow will be turbulent. And it makes sense. Take two simple examples. Take molasses or honey and compare them to water. Imagine that you have a stream of honey, and a stream of water. Which one do you think will more likely develop turbulence? I am sure you will say water, and you would be right. So what happens in this case, that some of you may ask, well, if you're saying that if the diameter decreases, then we know that at the beginning we mentioned that the flow and the velocity and the area are related. So if you're saying here that the diameter decreases, well, velocity is going to increase. We already know that. So how do we solve this? Okay, well, here's the thing. The diameter is related to pi r squared, right? So a twofold decrease in the radius is going to affect the diameter to the power 2, right? So a decrease by a factor of 2 in the diameter is going to cause an increase of 4-fold in the velocity, and that's how it's going to increase Reynolds number, and thus it will more likely cause turbulence. In atherosclerotic regions or vessels where the plaques are protruding into the lumen, the critical Reynolds number is also much lower, and thus normal velocity, which normally does not lead to turbulence, i.e. normal velocity where the blood is actually moving in a laminar mechanism, laminar flow, can still cause turbulence. And this turbulence is going to generate murmurs where you as cardiologists are going to listen to and figure out what's happening with the patient. Now take this example where we are comparing the turbulent flow in terms of an application and how the flow in an obstructed or stenotic vessel is going to have an impact on the delta P, on the pressure needed. So for a given change in flow, so the Q here is flow. We're measuring flow. For the same change in flow, going from volume 1 to volume 2, we are projecting them on a normal healthy vessel. That's the normal non-stenotic. And this is the pressure versus flow for a stenotic vessel. For the same flow, go back to this one and project on the blood pressure. I need delta P1 in healthy vessel. For the same flow, project them onto the pressure flow relation of a stenotic vessel. I would need this much delta P. So obviously, the more stenotic the vessel is, the more pressure you would need. Remember a while ago we said a lot of energy is going to be lost and dissipated because blood is not moving simply in a laminar way. They are not all the layers are moving parallel. Some of the fluid is going to be hitting the walls. We said axially and so perpendicular to the line of movement as well. So stenosis is going to impart an effect on us, which is you're going to need a larger increase in pressure, that is delta P, for the same increase in flow. Let's take some of the examples that will show us how turbulence has clinical implications. In cases of anemia, hematocrit is going to be decreased, viscosity is going to decrease, and thus Reynolds number is going to increase, and thus will be more likely to have turbulence. If we have a thrombus, the diameter is going to decrease, the velocity is going to increase, and remember a while ago the equation, what happens when there is a decrease by twofold in the radius, what's going to happen to the velocity. Reynolds is going to increase, and thus turbulence is going to be more likely. So these are some of the examples of clinical examples of that are related to laminar versus turbulent flow. One of the other clinical values of this important concept that we're explaining in vascular physiology is that turbulence is going to create sounds, generates murmurs that you can hear with a stethoscope. Because higher velocities are going to enhance turbulence, murmurs are going to be intensified as the flow increases. For example, in the pregnant woman, there's going to be a higher cardiac output, obviously. That means higher velocity. And remember the equation, the higher the velocity, the more likely that we'll have turbulence, right? Because Reynolds number is going to increase. Also, there's a chance of having anemia. Anemia is going to lead to lower viscosity. Remember, a while ago we gave the example and we showed that. So lower viscosity, that both higher velocity and lower viscosity are going to exacerbate the condition. The Reynolds number is going to increase, and the chance of turbulence is going to increase. Remember, laminar flow is silent. We're not going to hear anything when the blood flow is moving in a laminar mechanism. So in the turbulence, in cases of turbulence, the proximal portions of the aorta and the pulmonary artery, the Reynolds number can rise to several thousand during the rapid first phase of ejection by the ventricles. Remember, the heart is squeezing itself out and pumping all that blood at the very beginning. Immediately as the blood is leaving the heart, going into either the aorta or the pulmonary artery, and that's why the word proximal. So immediately as the blood is leaving, the chance of turbulence is going to be very high. The speed is extremely high. This is going to cause turbulence in the proximal aorta and the pulmonary artery, and the conditions are optimum for turbulence. There's a very high velocity of blood flow. There is a pulsatile nature of the flow, so it's not really smooth nature, and we'll elaborate on that in my other lecture. And there is also a sudden change in the vessel diameter. Remember, that's very important. We mentioned that a while ago when we talked about branching, and the diameter is very high. Remember, the diameter and Reynolds number are directly proportional to each other. In smaller vessels, however, Reynolds number is almost never high enough to cause turbulence, and that's why it continues smoothly. And that would be important for different functions, different, which is delivery of the blood in close proximity, in close vicinity of the organ, or later at the level of capillaries for exchange of nutrients and gases. So one of the applications of this is if you take a stethoscope and place it over the brachial artery, a normal person, you are not going to hear anything. No sound should be audible, right? Because blood flow is going in a laminar flow. As the heart starts to beat, these pulses are transmitted smoothly via laminar blood flow throughout the arteries, and no sound is going to be produced, right? Now, if you take a cuff and then you place it around the patient's arm and you inflate the pressure to a level that is above the patient's systolic blood pressure, there will be no sound audible. In this case, there is no sound because when you place the cuff around the arm and you inflated it to a pressure higher than the patient's highest blood pressure, which is the SBP, there is no blood. You've basically occluded blood flow. This is basically similar to a flexible tube or pipe with fluid in it that is being pinched shut. You're closing the tube for the movement of the blood, and there is no blood basically moving, and that's why you hear nothing, right? Okay. So now if the pressure starts to drop, or you start to drop the pressure to a level that is equal to the patient's SBP, systolic blood pressure, the first Korotkoff sound is going to be heard. And then as the pressure in the cuff is the same as the pressure that is being produced by the heart, some blood will start to pass through the upper arm that you just cuffed, right? So some blood is going to pass through when the pressure in the artery rises during the systole. This blood is going to flow in spurts as the pressure in the artery rises above the pressure in the cuff and then drops back beyond the cuffed region. This is going to result in turbulence. This turbulence is going to produce an audible sound, and that's the sound that you hear. As the pressure in the cuff continues to fall further and further, the thumping sounds that we talked about, you will continue to hear them as long, pay attention, as long as the pressure in the cuff is between the systolic and the diastolic pressures, as the arterial pressure keeps on rising above and dropping back below the pressure in the cuff. However, if the pressure in the cuff drops much further than, i.e. lower than the diastolic blood pressure, it is basically you've put no cuff. And then we mentioned in the beginning that this is the brachial artery in a normal, healthy person. The blood is moving in a laminar flow. You're not going to hear anything. So basically, as the pressure drops below the diastolic blood pressure, you're going to hear nothing because there's no restriction to blood flow. The blood flow is becoming smooth again, no turbulence, and that will produce no audible sound. This is basically what we just explained. At this point, you've inflated the cuff to, let's assume the patient has a blood pressure of 120. You don't know this, but let's assume that. So you've inflated it to, let's say, 160. And so you've basically, that pressure of the cuff is much more powerful than the pressure of the blood on the walls. So you've closed it, you hear nothing. As you start releasing the cuff, you don't know it's 120, right? We said we don't know. We assume it's 120 now for the sake of this example. So it's 160, you go down 150, 140, 130, and then as you get to the 120, the pressure from within is equal to the pressure from outside, and there are these pressure that's coming from the heart through the vessels, and then you're going to hear some of these throbbing forces, and then some blood is going to pass through. We're going from a large diameter to a much smaller diameter, and we mentioned that a while ago. When we go from a large to a small, that's likely going to create some turbulence. You can see the turbulence here. You're going to hear a sound, and that's the first sound. That's the first Korotkoff sound, and that's how you know that the systolic is 120. And let's assume that the diastolic is 80. So you keep deflating the cuff until you get to a level of 80. At that point in time, the pressure inside, the lowest pressure inside is 80, is equal to the lowest pressure on the outside. So the vessel goes back to normal. So blood is going to pass through normally. And then the flow is laminar. We mentioned laminar flow is silent. You hear nothing beyond this point. So that's the point when the last sound you hear, and you consider that the diastolic blood pressure. So, as a summary of the clinical significance, turbulence is important and has applications when we talk about constriction of arteries by atherosclerosis. Severe anemia is important. Having a thrombus is important. Stenotic or incompetent cardiac valves are going to affect turbulence. Now, let's look at how flow, vessel radius, and resistance are related to each other. In the figure here, what you see is you see the same amount of blood, 10 milliliters, distributed in different vessels, one of smaller radius and one of larger radius. You can see that the same 10 ml in the smaller radius is going to have more friction, right? So a larger area is going to be coming in close proximity, in touch, in physical contact with the wall of the vessel, with the endothelia. So we're going to have more impediment. Remember that flow is inversely proportional to the radius, right? To the resistance, I mean. So the smaller the radius, the more the resistance. The larger the radius, the less the resistance. Resistance is dictated by this equation, which says that more length, more resistance, more viscosity, more resistance. Imagine that you're going to withdraw you're going to withdraw water through a straw, okay? Or you're withdrawing honey through a straw. It's going to be much more difficult to withdraw honey through a straw than water. Viscosity is going to be a factor. So more viscosity, more resistance. And as the radius decreases, so we go from here to here, as the radius decreases, the resistance is going to increase. We already know this equation from before, right? Flow is equal to the pressure gradient divided by the resistance. Equate these two together, you will arrive at flow is directly proportional to delta P. Makes sense, because if you have more pressure gradient, it's as if you're pushing more blood through. If you have bigger radius, you're going to push more flow. If you have more length, you're going to have less flow because you're spending time with that length. And again, if the viscosity increases, the flow is going to decrease. In an average healthy adult, there is no appreciable change in length. There's no appreciable change in viscosity. So the most important factor is the radius, because we can play with that. And plus, what is more important is this, power 4. The same equation here, even if you visit this equation, you'll get to it again. A subtle change in the radius is going to have dramatic effects on the resistance, or a subtle change in the radius is going to have dramatic effects on the flow. On this side, you see that I'm sorry, a change of diameter, an increase in six-fold can lead to approximately 1,300-fold increase in the flow. So change from 1 to 6 led to approximately 1,296 increase in the flow. So obviously the most important parameter to play with in order to regulate flow or resistance, and consequently later on the blood pressure, would be the flow. Conductance is basically the opposite of the reciprocal of the resistance. So the more resistance you have, it means your vessel is not a good conductor. The larger the diameter, obviously it means the vessel is going to be a better conductor. So larger diameter means larger conductance, smaller resistance. Your vessels are connected in series and in parallel. Some of them are in series, some of them are in parallel. We'll get to some detail next. When we talk about vessels in series, the total resistance is going to be the summation of the individual resistance. When we talk about parallel resistance, it would be the inverse. So 1 over R total, or R equivalent, it would be the summation of the individual inverse of each resistance. So 1 over R1 plus 1 over R2, and etc., depending on how many resistors we have, or resistant vessels in this case. So remember, 1 over R from the previous slide, that's conductance. So basically C total is equal to C1 plus C2 plus C3 plus C4. Now, This equation tells us one interesting thing, that if you add more blood vessels, to a given network like this, all right, that is going to increase conductance, and thus is going to reduce resistance. Some of you may wonder, this should be, no, it should be the opposite. It should be, we are actually increasing resistance. We are actually not increasing resistance, because in parallel, the summation is the inverse, is 1 over R. It's not like the arithmetic addition of each resistance. So basically what's happening when you create more of these parallel vessels, you have created a new route. And thus, this means each of these routes or routes is going to be a new pathway, a new conductance for blood to pass through, and thus you are reducing the impediment that you have. Yes, each vessel is going to impart a certain resistance per se, in the sense that blood is passing through it and it's coming in contact with the endothelia, with the walls. But the overall is going to be, we've created more chances for blood to pass through. And this goes back to what I said, that C total is going to be C1 plus C2 plus C3 plus C4, and thus if you keep adding more of these, you are going to create a better conductance. So in series, that's when the artery becomes an arteriole, becomes a capillary, although in reality an artery becomes many arterioles, okay? And then each of these arterioles is going to branch into many capillaries, and then these capillaries are going to join backwards into a venule, and so on. Now the parallel resistance, this is interesting. This is how your body is. The cerebral, coronary, etc., renal, and so on, they are all in parallel with each other. So the summation is going to be the inverse of the R total. It would be the summation of the inverse of each resistance alone. Now, parallel circuits, one of the clinical values, this is important because, well, we said brain, kidney, GI are in parallel. Blood flow to tissue is a fraction, because we mentioned it is 1 over, it is one organ out of many organs. So if you remember your electricity from your physics courses, it's the same. We're taking the same voltage and we're distributing it to these different light bulbs or whatever is in parallel circuits. This flow that we're talking about, that is going to every single tissue, to every organ, is determined by the resistance in that very tissue and the pressure gradient that we have. We mentioned this. If we have more pressure gradient, we're going to have more flow. If we have more resistance in that area, we're not going to have a high flow. And therefore, what is the clinical value of this? If you amputate a leg or you remove a kidney, you've removed a part of a parallel circuit, right? So you've basically reduced one of the conductances. You've increased the resistance. So in this case, go back to the previous equation where we put the equation 1 over R total is equal to 1 over R1 and so on. Give whatever number you want to each to each resistance, and then say you've removed one of the routes. You've removed the kidney, for example. That's going to increase resistance, reduce conductance, and reduce the flow to that given area. How this is impacted on systemic resistance. This is an example of a vascular tree, artery going to many arterioles, each of which go into many capillaries, and capillaries then join back into a given venule, many venules into a given vein, and then eventually we will not put the vena cava at the end or the aorta at the beginning, but this is basically the same concept. So the way we do this is we solve the capillaries, we get the equivalent, then we get the equivalent of the artery, capillary, and venule, so that becomes 1R, and then we solve for this arteriole, capillaries, and venule, we make another R here, then we solve 1R top, 1R below, so we get to basically as if we have them like this, but basically this is one big R here. But for the sake of explaining, I'm putting them as if it's like this, and there's nothing wrong with this equation. So this is correct like this. So let's take the values that we have. It's basically 170, 28, and 1, and that comes to around 100 the values for resistance. Now let's increase the resistance of the artery, the large artery, by 4-fold. The summation is going to come down to 3% increase. So 1 over 3, 100 to 1/3, that's going to be a 3% increase. Now let's see what happens when you increase the resistance of the arteriole by 4-fold. What's going to happen is you're going to have a 280 for the value of the arteriole, and the total increase is going to be 210. This simply means that a small change in the arteriolar diameter is going to have a dramatic effect on the overall resistance. Now go back that this is related to flow and blood pressure. So basically, if we modulate this, we're going to be modulating total resistance, flow, blood pressure, and so on. And the reason for that is very simple. If you look at this table, you will find that if we look at the wall, that's the thickness, lumen, that's the space. The highest wall to lumen ratio is that of these arterioles, the very ones that are going to dictate or going to govern blood pressure and overall resistance. What we mean by this, wall to lumen, that means basically we have more wall, more smooth muscles per given unit of lumen. In other words, I have more chances of controlling the lumen in an arteriole owing to the fact or by virtue of the presence of a larger content of smooth muscle cells per lumen. I say per lumen because you've covered anatomy and you know that the aorta and larger vessels are more muscular than this. And that's why we refer to arterioles as, we don't call them muscular arteries. We call them resistance arteries because they are the ones that impart the most important muscles. I'll stop here. Next time we'll talk about the local controls, the extrinsic controls, and we'll talk about the different parameters that affect the viscosity, distensibility, and vascular compliance. Thank you very much. Please, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact me. Do not hesitate to email me or call my office at extension 4891. Or if you're around, you want to pass by my office, I have an open door policy. I would love to see you. I'd love to discuss anything, any issues related to the course with you. Thank you very much.